The wind howled through the streets of Deadwood Gulch, Montana, in the winter of 1874, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeped into bones and souls alike. The saloon, a ramshackle building with a flickering lantern above its door, was the only place offering warmth, though not the kind that could thaw a frozen heart. Inside, the air reeked of tobacco-cheap whiskey and the boisterous laughter of men who'd long since traded their morals for another round of cards. Jesse Colton sat at a corner table, his face flushed from one too many drinks, his fingers twitching as he tossed down another losing hand. His pockets were empty, his Colt peacemaker already pawned, and now all he had left was a bitterness as sharp as the wind outside. The dealer, a wiry man with a smirk that could curdle milk, leaned back in his chair. "Well, Jesse," he drawled, "you're about as broke as a church mouse. Got anything left to bet?" Jesse's gaze flicked across the room, landing on his wife Eleanor. She stood by the stove, her hands clasped tight, her shoulders squared, like she was bracing for a storm. Her dress was worn thin, her shawl barely keeping out the chill, but it was the way she held herself like she was already gone that made Jesse's lip curl. 5 years, he announced loud enough for every drunk in the place to hear. 5 damn years and not a single child. Useless as a screen door on a submarine. The room erupted in laughter, rough and mean. Jesse slammed his fist on the table. "I'll trade her for a sack of wheat." The laughter turned raucous men, slapping their knees and howling like coyotes. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes on the floor, refusing to let them see her break. Then from the shadows near the bar, a voice cut through the noise like a knife. "I'll take her." The room fell silent as Caleb Mercer stood. He was a quiet man, a rancher who'd lost his wife to fever 2 winters back, and he carried himself with a stillness that spoke of storms weathered. Without a word, he strode outside, and returned with a burlap sack, dropping it onto the table with a thud that made the glasses rattle. "That's twice what she's worth to you," he said, his voice steady. Jesse sneered. "All yours, Mercer." Caleb didn't spare him a glance. Instead, he looked at Eleanor, his storm-gray eyes holding hers. "You got a choice," he said softer now. "You walk out that door with me or you stay. But if you come, it's on your terms." Eleanor's breath caught. No one had ever asked her permission for anything. The room seemed to hold its breath as she lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear as a bell. "I'll go." And just like that, the wind outside didn't feel so cold anymore. Caleb extended his hand palm up a silent offer in the dim light of the saloon. Eleanor stared at it, the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears pressing down on her. The stench of liquor and unwashed men clung to the air, but all she could focus on was the quiet strength in Caleb's steady gaze. Then, with a shuddering breath, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, not possessive, not demanding, just sure. The moment they stepped outside, the world changed. The biting Montana wind sliced through her thin shawl, but it carried the scent of pine and snow instead of sweat and whiskey. Behind them, the saloon doors swung shut, muffling the jeers of the men inside. Caleb didn't look back. He led her toward his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, stamping its hooves in the cold. As he untied the reins, Eleanor hesitated. The thought of riding away with a stranger into the unknown made her pulse race. But then Caleb did something unexpected. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn, leather flask. "Coffee," he said, handing it to her. "Spiked with a bit of whiskey. Ain't much, but it'll warm you." The gesture was small, but it cracked something inside her. She took a sip, the heat spreading through her chest like a promise. Caleb didn't rush her. He shook out a thick buffalo robe and draped it over the horse's back before turning to her. "You ever ridden before?" he asked. Eleanor shook her head. "Then we'll take it slow." His voice was calm, but there was a steel beneath it, the kind that said he'd tear down the world before letting harm come to her now. He cupped his hands to boost her up, and when she settled into the saddle, he didn't mount immediately. Instead, he checked the girth, adjusted the stirrups, and then, just as she began to wonder, he swung up behind her. The town of Deadwood Gulch faded behind them, swallowed by the night. The only sounds were the crunch of snow under hoof and the distant cry of a lone coyote. Then, out of nowhere, Caleb spoke again, his voice low. "You got a name you prefer, or is Eleanor still yours?" The question caught her off guard. After years of being called woman or wife, hearing her name on his lips felt like a revelation. "Eleanor," she whispered. "Good," he said. "A woman ought to keep her name." And with that, the horse carried them forward into the vast snow-covered wilderness where the past couldn't reach them, and the future was theirs to shape. The ranch house stood solid against the endless Montana night, its windows glowing like a beacon in the wilderness. Eleanor hesitated on the threshold, the warmth from inside brushing her cheeks, foreign, yet achingly familiar. The little girl, no more than 6, with wild curls escaping her knitted scarf, kept hold of her hand, swinging it slightly as if they were old friends. "Pa said you're staying," the girl announced, matter of fact. "I'm Mary. That's Jake and Eli." She pointed to the boys who hovered near the hearth, trying and failing to look indifferent. The older one, Jake, scuffed his boot against the floorboards, but finally met Eleanor's gaze. "You cook?" he asked, blunt, as only a boy of 12 could be. Before she could answer, a voice cut in from the kitchen. "Lord almighty, Jake, where are your manners?" A woman emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She had sharp blue eyes, and hair streaked with silver pulled into a no-nonsense knot. "I'm Martha," she said, nodding at Eleanor. "Caleb's sister. Welcome home." Home. The word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Martha didn't seem to expect one. She just gestured to the pot simmering on the stove. "Stew's ready. You look like you could use a bowl." Then came the moment that unraveled her completely. Mary tugged Eleanor toward a low bench by the fire, where a scruffy dog lay curled. The animal lifted its head, sniffed once, then thumped its tail. "That's Bear," Mary said. "He don't like most folks, but he likes you." Eleanor reached out her fingers, trembling. The dog licked her hand, and suddenly, the dam broke. A tear slipped free, then another. She pressed her lips together, but Martha was already there, pressing a chipped bowl into her hands. "Eat," she said, not unkindly. "Then you can cry all you need to." Outside the wind howled, but inside the fire crackled, the stew steamed, and for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something unclench in her chest. Caleb entered quietly, snow dusting his shoulders. He took in the scene, the children clustered near Eleanor Martha, ladling stew, the dog now wedged firmly against Eleanor's legs, and something flickered in his storm-gray eyes. Without a word, he hung his hat on the peg by the door and reached for a bowl. No grand speeches, no demands. Just a place at the table and a family that asked nothing of her but her presence. That night, as the fire burned low, Eleanor realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't salvation. It was a choice. And for the first time in too long, the choice was hers. The children's chatter faded as Caleb led Eleanor down the hallway, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The bedroom door swung open to reveal a space so unlike the cramped corners she'd known, sun-bleached calico curtains, a braided rug, worn soft by time, and on the nightstand, a sprig of dried lavender tied with twine. "Found that last summer," Caleb said, noticing her gaze. "Smells better than old boots." The unexpected joke startled a breath of laughter from her, the sound foreign in her own ears. He moved to the window, adjusting the curtain against the night cold. "Storm's coming. You'll hear the shutter rattle, but it holds." His hands, rough from work, lingered on the latch, testing and shoring. A man who fixed what was broken. Then came the moment that undid her. From his pocket, he produced a small leather pouch and set it beside the key. "Peppermint," he said. For the tea. Martha swears by it when the wind cuts cold. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she touched the pouch. Such a simple thing, yet it spoke volumes. Not charity, not obligation, just kindness freely given. Down the hall, Martha's voice carried as she herded the children to bed. Brush your teeth, or the tooth fairy'll think you're raising coyotes. A giggle, a thump of footsteps, then silence. Caleb paused at the door lamplight gilding the scar across his knuckles. Tomorrow, he said quietly. If you're of a mind, there's a mare in the barn, needs gentling. Doesn't trust men much. His eyes met hers. Figure you might understand each other. The unspoken offer hung in the air, not just work, but purpose. A reason to rise at dawn. When the door closed, Eleanor pressed the peppermint pouch to her nose, breathing in the sharp, sweet scent. Outside, the first snowflakes of the coming storm spiraled past the window. For the first time in memory, the night felt not like an ending, but a beginning. She turned the key in the lock, not because she feared what lay beyond, but because she could. And when she blew out the lamp, the darkness didn't swallow her whole. The cinnamon-scented warmth of the kitchen wrapped around Eleanor like an embrace. Flour dusted the children's noses as they kneaded dough with more enthusiasm than skill, their laughter bouncing off the rough-hewn beams overhead. Caleb's presence was a quiet constant, his hand steady as he shaped biscuits his shoulder, a solid warmth beside hers, when he reached across to sprinkle flour. Then came the moment that would stay etched in her memory. Little Mary, standing on a stool to peer into the bowl, suddenly grabbed Eleanor's wrist. "You gotta do it like this," she declared, pressing Eleanor's fingers into the dough with surprising strength. The girl's hands were sticky with honey, her braids coming undone, but her grin was triumphant. "See, now they'll taste right." A lump rose in Eleanor's throat. Not since childhood had someone touched her with such unselfish certainty. No fear, no calculation, just small hands, believing she belonged. The biscuits were slightly lopsided, some burned at the edges, but when Caleb pulled the tray from the oven, he nodded approval. "Best I've had," he lied solemnly, and the children cheered. Later, as twilight painted the snow blue, Eleanor found herself on the porch with Caleb. The wind had died, leaving the world hushed. He handed her a tin mug of cider, their fingers brushing briefly warmth against the cold. "You ever break a horse?" he asked, suddenly staring at the barn where the skittish mare waited. Eleanor shook her head. "First time's always the hardest." He took a slow sip. "Not because of the horse, because you gotta trust yourself more than you fear the fall." The words hung between them, heavier than the cider's spice. Somewhere in the pasture, the mare whickered as if agreeing. Inside, Martha began singing an old hymn, the children joining in off-key. The sound drifted through the open window, wrapping around them both a promise, a welcome, a home. And for the first time, Eleanor realized she wasn't just healing. She was learning how to run free. The morning sun glinted off the fresh-carved sign, each letter standing bold against the weathered wood Ward ranch, Caleb and Eleanor. The scent of pine pitch still clung to it, sharp and alive. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Behind her boots crunched softly in the snow. She didn't need to turn to know it was Caleb. His shadow fell across the sign, his hands, those rough, capable hands, resting lightly on the top rail. "Figured it was time," he said simply. The world seemed to tilt. That morning in the saloon felt a lifetime away. Jessie's drunken sneer, the sack of wheat hitting the table, the way the men had laughed. Now here stood a man who'd carved her name into the bones of his land, without demand or expectation. A gust of wind sent snow crystals skittering across the path. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, a horseshoe nail, bent into a crude ring. "Found this in the mare's stall," he said, turning it over in his fingers. "They say it's luck when a horse throws one." He held it out to her, his eyes never leaving hers. Not a proposal, not a claim, Just a gift offered with open palms, like everything else in this place. Down by the barn, the children's voices carried on the cold air as they argued over who got to name the new calf. Martha shouted something about mittens, and the dog barked in agreement. Life messy and vibrant unfolding around them. Eleanor took the nail. The metal was warm from his pocket, the edges worn smooth. When she closed her fingers around it, she realized something with sudden clarity. This wasn't just a home he'd given her. It was a place where she could choose to stay. And for the first time in her life, the choice was easy. The air turned to ice as Thomas Ray's revolver gleamed in the winter light. Eleanor felt Lucy's small hands tremble against her skirt, but something new rose in her chest. Not fear, but a fierce, burning protectiveness. She stepped forward, placing herself between Thomas and the child. "You don't want this fight, Thomas," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Thomas's laugh was raw as a fresh wound. "Since when do you tell me what I want?" He waved the gun toward the sign. "You really think some carved letters change anything? You're mine." A shadow moved at the edge of the yard. Martha emerged from the house, a rifle cradled casually in her arms. She didn't speak, just leaned against the porch post, the barrel catching the sun. Silas took another step forward, his hands loose at his sides. "Last chance to ride out," he said so calm it was deadly. Thomas's finger twitched on the trigger. Crack. A shot split the air, but it didn't come from Thomas's gun. The revolver flew from his hand as a bullet struck the barrel, sending it spinning into the snow. Everyone turned. Eli, the younger boy, stood wide-eyed by the fence, a smoking Colt in his grip. I aimed for the gun," he stammered. For one heartbeat, the world hung suspended. Then Thomas lunged for his revolver. Silas moved like lightning. One fist connected with Thomas's jaw, sending him sprawling into the snow. He didn't get up. The silence that followed was broken only by Lucy's quiet sniffle. Eleanor knelt to hug the girl, her own hands shaking, now that it was over. Martha broke the spell, striding forward with a length of rope. "Well," she said, tying Thomas's hands with practiced efficiency. "Reckon the sheriff will be wanting to hear about this." As Silas hauled Thomas to his feet, their eyes met over the man's slumped shoulders. No words were needed. The sign still stood behind them, the letters unshaken. Ward Ranch, Caleb and Eleanor. And for the first time, Eleanor truly believed it. The horse's hooves threw up clods of frozen earth as Thomas reined in sharply, his face a mask of fury. But this time, he wasn't alone. 3 riders fanned out behind him, hard-eyed men with the look of hired guns. Their hands hovered near their holsters as Thomas dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate force. "Thought you could shame me in front of the whole damn territory." Thomas spat, his voice raw with venom. He jerked his chin toward the sign. "That ends today." Eleanor felt Caleb tense beside her, but it was Martha who spoke first from the doorway, her rifle propped casually against her shoulder. "You brought friends to a family gathering, Thomas. How unoriginal." One of the gunmen shifted uneasily. The other 2 exchanged glances. They hadn't counted on a woman with a Winchester and the steady hands to use it. Caleb stepped off the porch, his movements deliberate. "You want to settle this, Ray? Then settle it with me." He unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop into the snow. Man to man. A cruel smile twisted Thomas's lips as he mirrored the gesture. The hired guns stayed back as the 2 men circled each other in the trampled snow. Eleanor's nails bit into the porch rail. She'd seen Thomas fight before, dirty, brutal, fueled by whiskey and pride. But Caleb moved like the land itself, patient and unyielding. The first blow came from Thomas, a wild haymaker. Caleb sidestepped easily. The second grazed his jaw, drawing blood. Then Caleb struck a single devastating punch to the ribs that sent Thomas staggering. As Thomas wheezed, one of his men reached for his gun. Crack. A bullet kicked up snow at the man's feet. All eyes turned to Eli, standing tall on the barn roof with Caleb's rifle. "Next one goes between your eyes," the boy announced, his voice only shaking a little. Thomas roared and charged Caleb blindly. This time, Caleb didn't hold back. One punch to the gut, another to the jaw, and Thomas crumpled like a sack of grain. The remaining gunmen looked at each other, then at Martha's unwavering rifle, and decided their pay wasn't worth dying over. They collected their unconscious employer and rode out, leaving only silence and the fading echo of hoofbeats behind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the snow in hues of blood and gold, Caleb turned to Eleanor. No words were needed. The sign still stood unshaken, and this time, when the cold crept in, it was Caleb's arms that warmed her, not as a protector, but as an equal, a partner. The choice, as always, had been hers. The last crimson streaks of sunset bled across the snow as the sheriff's horse disappeared into the gathering dusk. Eleanor's fingers still trembled on the porch rail, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "It's not over," she said, turning to Caleb. "Not really." He studied her face, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You think he'll come back?" She shook her head. "Not Thomas, but the past. That doesn't just ride away." The words hung between them, as tangible as the cold. Inside, Martha was already bustling about, shooing the children upstairs with promises of hot cider. The familiar rhythms of the house continued, the clank of the stove lid, the hiss of boiling water, the creak of floorboards underfoot. Life, stubborn and persistent. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the bent horseshoe nail he'd given her days before. "You kept it," he observed, turning it over in his calloused fingers. Eleanor met his gaze. "Some things are worth holding on to." A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he pressed it back into her palm. "Then we'll face what comes. Together." The first stars winked to life above the ranch as they stepped inside, where the firelight glowed golden against the windows, a beacon in the wilderness, a promise against the dark. And when the door closed behind them, it wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of everything. The last light of day gilded the ranch in liquid gold as Eleanor walked beside Caleb toward the house, their boots leaving twin tracks in the snow. The scent of wood smoke and horses hung crisp in the air, mingling with something sweeter, the promise of apple pie Martha had left cooling on the windowsill. Inside, the children's laughter spilled from the kitchen, where Mary was undoubtedly sneaking scraps to the dog. The normalcy of it all wrapped around Eleanor like a well-worn quilt. Caleb paused at the steps, his hand brushing hers. "You're quiet," he observed, his voice rough with concern. Eleanor looked out across the land, their land where the new sign stood bold against the twilight. "I was just thinking," she said softly, "how strange it is to find yourself exactly where you're meant to be." His thumb traced the curve of her knuckles, calluses catching on wool. "Took us both the long way round." The kitchen window glowed yellow as Martha lit the lamps. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a lone coyote yipped its cry, carrying across the frozen creek. Caleb turned her hand over, pressing the horseshoe nail into her palm once more. "Keep it," he murmured. "For luck." But as Eleanor curled her fingers around the small metal curve, she knew she didn't need luck anymore. She had everything she'd never dared to want. And when Caleb's lips met hers again under the first stars of evening, the past finally released its grip, leaving only the future wide open and shining bright as the Montana sky.